The Romance of the Rose is one of these works that had an immense influence many centuries ago and has not maintained its popularity, but has still left a profound imprint on the Western psyche and probably one might say the spirit of everyone. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Allegory of Love, which current scholars of courtly love, which itself is a disputed term these days. Not all scholars think that C.S. Lewis's work stands up to all the evidence that we have since he wrote, but I think he provides a very insightful framework for trying to approach this topic. What he insists upon is the novelty of this sensibility of romantic love, passionate love, as something that did not exist in the ancient world, that of course characterizes the modern world. So we have something arising in the High Middle Ages, at the end of the 11th century, taking off in the 12th century, and then taking various forms after that. This poem, it belongs to the 13th century, the very crown of the Middle Ages. And in fact, it's in two parts. The first part would have been written about the time that St. Thomas Aquinas was born, and it was completed by Jean de Meun at about the time Thomas Aquinas died. So that gives you a sense of the time, the interesting times in which this poem spans. The 13th century was a period of immense historical consequence, but also it represents the flowering of the medieval culture. So that's something we have to grapple with, is how this poem belongs to that time. The heyday of the troubadours is right before this poem is written. So in the last decades of the 12th century, we get this flourishing of poetry sung by these itinerant, often poets, but also poets that would be attached to courts in the south of France. The south of France is the milieu, south of what we call France. At the time, this is just a different country, as it were. It's nations weren't the way people thought of territorial divisions back then, but we have the emergence of a kind of material that hadn't been seen before. And that's what these troubadours sang about. This kind of eros, which we've talked about. I mean, we've talked about it all along. Eros is something that matters in terms of the emergence of philosophy. We see this in Plato, is that the great instigator of our ascent to the heights of self-realization or self-transcendence. But in the time of the Middle Ages, we get Eros is in disrepute insofar as we might link Eros to sexual passion. There was a lot of grappling by churchmen, especially, and this would usually be, of course, celibates, often monks, who either thought that sexual desire was itself evil, a moral evil, or at least an evil that is something that one suffered, and that it wouldn't be ideal to have that pathology, as it were. Leading up to a kind of an act that isn't intrinsically evil, obviously, because the union of man and woman is something necessary for the continuance of the race. But that union would be either an act tainted by an evil, or at least the whole thing is just, it's part of an unfortunate occurrence, right? The fall. And that was more or less the majority report. By the time you get to Aquinas, he's going to moderate that. He's going to say that it's the real reason, the difficulty with erotic passion, understood as the sexual love, is the suspension of the intellect, and that's going to be where he finds the inconvenience, and that before the fall you wouldn't have had that suspension of the intellect. So against that backdrop, and along with the fact that marriage itself is, at this time, at least among the upper classes, simply a matter of alliances, a practical, a way of trying to secure inheritance and so on. This was a difficulty to think of marriage in terms of eros at all, or certainly in terms of love, of passionate love. I mean, the thing that we take for granted as is kind of the natural template for marriage is just not the case in the Middle Ages, and certainly not before. So this is the if you have this new sensibility where romantic love is something that is moving you, is something that is become a new motive of human existence, and marriage is not supposed to be a home for that. It's not something that makes sense in terms of the whole question of how we see love and the old motives for human action. So philotimia, which was a matter of honor, that is, the man always pursued honor as the great incentive, right? So if in the new order of romance, a man is supposed to subject himself, is to become abject, then that's a very different model of subjectivity than we found in the Iliad, or we find in Gilgamesh. It's a very different kind of masculinity, certainly. Is it the case that when we read a poem like The Romance of the Rose, do we recognize this kind of guy, this man who is supposed to surrender himself, is to be a servant of love? I mean, how do you get that change? How do you get from Achilles to this person who's having this dream in The Romance of the Rose? And that's the question that C.S. Lewis wants to ask. It's a question I think we all need to try to think about, because how do we get from a view of the untrammeled alpha to the gentleman, right? Part of the reason the church wanted to promulgate the notion of chivalry, which is part of is the context for courtly love, but it's not identifiable with courtly love. Chivalry was a way of just saying, we need to channel aristocratic violence, this male extroversion. We need to be able to make it, we need to manage it. Courtly love, given this new sentiment of romantic passion, courtly love emerges out of that context. So Lewis talks about how there are 4 marks of courtly love: humility, courtesy, adultery, and religion of love. He talks about humility very interestingly. He says the reason there's this kind of abjection is the original matrix of the medieval man was to have this very warm, deep love for the vassal for his lord. And it was that is that template that gets transposed somehow into the male-female dynamic. And so he leaves a lot of mystery there, and it seems to me it is a very mysterious thing. The whole question for us now, how does this apply to what has been called the war of the sexes, right? I mean, how do men and women need to relate to each other? This notion of gallantry is a way of saying, well, shouldn't the restraint of the physical power of a man just be part of what is understood to be the male, what you would expect out of a male development? On the other hand, this idealization of the feminine, we've had feminists critique that, and I think for very good reason, but also I think they trade off of that too. And that's one of these ambiguities, right? Is that the war of the sexes, which we have to bracket the violence, which must never be, of course, from either side, but obviously it's the men who have historically exercised violence. You got to bracket, you got to make sure that that's out of bounds. But then how is it the case that men and women relate to each other? How do we find ways to be decent to each other? And how, in fact, what kind of things do we need to worry about in terms of how we undercut each other? And that's part of, and that whole story is something that gets opened up because of this kind of romantic sentimentality. That is, before this, women aren't on the agenda at all. This literature puts women in a way into the story, and that's a profound kind of shift. So